My name is Rasim Jagulov. I teach at the Russian and Slavic department at NYU, and it's really my unadulterated pleasure today to be introducing my friend, Dr. Nikolay Erofeev, an architectural historian whose work focuses on socialist architecture, housing, urban planning, and socialist internationalism. His book manuscript, Experiments in Concrete, Diversity and Debate in the Design of Soviet Housing, 1955 to 1990, explores the design and production of Soviet housing at the intersection of architecture, planning, and urban sociology. He's done more than anybody else to rehabilitate the Khrushchevka, the prefab apartment buildings begun in the Khrushchev era, and to help us understand why so many ordinary people in the Soviet Union and beyond appreciated about it. Currently, Dr. Erofeev is an Alexander Humboldt Fellow at the University of Kassel, having received his DPhil in history at the University of Oxford in 2020, and then held fellowships at the University of Basel and the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at New York University. I learned a great deal from our New York conversations. And though we'll have less than an hour and a half today, and in this virtual format, you'll really learn a great deal about the topic of Dr. Erofeev's talk, architectural and urban exchanges between Mongolia, the Soviet Union, China, and Poland during the Cold War. Kolya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosen, for this fantastic introduction. Yes, and for this opportunity to present. I'm very honored. So I'll be presenting my research on Mongolia, which is still a work in progress, so don't be too judgmental. And I very much look forward for your feedback and kind of comments. So on 11th of July 1961, the celebration of the 40th anniversary of Mongolian Communist Revolution started in Ulaanbaatar. And this was a commemoration of extraordinary sight, which involved like military parade, mass demonstrations, another form of the demonstrating the support of masses. Delegations from 20 different countries arrived in Mongolia, from Eastern European countries, also India, Indonesia, Cambodia, Algeria, Iraq. And a Polish delegation came on the highest level with Gomulka, Vladislav Gomulka. I can see him here. So this event was also a major showcase of socialist international assistance to Mongolia, and it involved the grand opening of many buildings, among them a central department store, here on this picture constructed with the assistance of China in Ulaanbaatar. Also a Soviet house building factory, Czechoslovak leather manufacturing plant, Korean school named Mongol-Soviet Friendship. And these facilities was used as a central staging for this public event and often depicted as this kind of gifts donated in the fulfillment of international duties by fraternal countries. Visiting this delegation, these facilities, delegations from various countries took on obligations to provide even more assistance to Mongolia, which included loans for the development of Mongolian construction industry and the development of this industrial complex of Darkhan with facilities for the production of cement, concrete, and wood. And indeed, during the Cold War, Mongolia received massive international assistance. So in the beginning of this century, Mongolia was one of the most isolated countries in the world with circa 1 million strong population, with livestock herding norms comprising the overwhelming majority of it. And the country lacked financial and healthcare organizations and other institutions typical of modern states. So you can see the capital formed of these nomad dwellings, which are called gers, organized around monasteries. And after the foundation of Soviet-dependent Mongolian People's Republic in 1924, the country embarked on the socialist development path and was assisted by multiple socialist countries, by Soviet Union, but also by China, especially in a period of peaceful coexistence in the 50s. And also by a number of Eastern European countries after Mongolia established diplomatic relations with them in the 50s. So with Bulgaria, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. And this international assistance comprised the 80% of the overall investment in the country, which is a very significant number. This investment could be compared in some aspects with investments in Soviet Central Asian republics such Tajik, Uzbek, SSR. But in the case of Mongolia, these assistance obligations were split between various countries. This assistance has recently been discussed in a literature as part of the solidarity campaign and socialist internationalism. But literature has emphasized the multiplicity of such exchanges, but often it discusses it as case studies of particular engagements of specific countries. So, for example, Soviet Union and Mali, or East Germany and Vietnam. And in this framework, these projects are often discussed within this dichotomy between dispatcher in a global north and receiver in a global south. And in the context of Sino-Soviet split, with assistance from Soviet Union and China to the third world countries, often seen as this result of rivalry or the competition between two different antagonistic models of development. Yet I would argue that from the side of Mongolian construction sites, the story of these exchanges is quite different. It's not a story of relations between provider and receiver, but rather of multilateral and asymmetrical and complementary assistance. So in order to construct facilities and render them operational, Mongolian actors had resort to the aid of multiple countries at once, which provided equipment, helped prepare construction site, find construction skilled laborers. And the countries were providing addressing the specific requests of Mongolian actors, providing highly asymmetrical assistance. These asymmetries soon hindered the vision of harmonious international collaboration in the name of socialist solidarity and created many tensions between these official pronouncements of internationalism and the situation on the ground. I would argue that this focus on multilateral exchanges may help to overcome this usual dichotomies between provider and receiver, but also stresses the questions of collaboration and division of labor. It also helped to uncover a much more active role of Mongolian actors in these exchanges. And in the context of Sino-Soviet split, this focus on multilateralism demonstrates that Soviet Union and Chinese assistance was highly asymmetrical and could not represent two competing models of development. In contrast, the division of labor between the two countries created multiple codependencies between them too, which continued even after the Sino-Soviet split. So one good case to illustrate this dynamics is one of the factories which was constructed with the Polish assistance. It was an obligation site by Władysław Gamulka in Ulaanbaatar. It's a silicon brick factory. It is here on the right of this picture, which was constructed in Darkhan. Yes, and I will look at planning, provision of infrastructure, finding required laborers for its construction, and also at the urban space produced as a result of these exchanges. So Mongolian officials started looking for ways of securing this technical assistance for the production of brick in mid-50s. Then the leader of Mongolia, Yemzhagin Tsedenbal, sent a letter to Soviet officials asking for aid, which involved, among other things, this brick factory. And he explained that it would help Mongolia solving the housing crisis and establishing the socialist model of development in the country. Upon receipt, the Tsedenbal request was scrutinized by Soviet experts. They came up with a long-winded report containing economic justifications, stating that they were not convinced that Mongolia actually needed this factory because there was another one currently under construction by China. And Mongolia could cover the needs for the brick if used officially of a server factory. Instead, they proposed to provide a house building factory of prefabricated panels. Its construction would be covered by a Soviet loan, and the plant would be made operational by the anniversary of the revolution. So it was grand opened during this event. Mongolians agreed to receive this panel factory. However, they were left unconvinced that they actually didn't need the other factory. And they continued looking for assistance from other donors. They sent another request to Poles shortly before the anniversary of the revolution. And these negotiations with Poles also didn't go smoothly. So they seem to be skeptical about the need of such factory. And Polish ambassador to Mongolia later reported that Polish specialists have repeatedly, including official requests, stated that due to remoteness of raw materials, a building of such factory is economically unprofitable. However, the Mongolians insisted. And the factory was eventually included in this assistance plan and constructed. So not only Mongolian actors insisted to construct a factory, they will also ask the Poles to amend the initial project, changing the capacity. And this exchange is indicative that despite all odds and the resistance of partners, Ulaanbaatar was able to promote its vision for the priorities of the development. And having multiple cooperating countries allowed them to gain much more flexibility in these negotiations. So in another case, Soviet experts also refused to fund a project of a metallurgical plant, also considering it unprofitable. And then the project was transferred to China. It was soon put on hold due to Sino-Soviet split, but Mongolian officials continued to looking for new providers and were only able to find it in the 90s. So this metallurgical plant was constructed with the assistance of Japan. So as we see, the Ulaanbaatar soon perfected the skills of taking advantages of multilateralism and playing their neighbors against one another. The involvement of various countries in Mongolia created tremendous obstacles in Soviet efforts to promote centralized planning in the country. So Soviet experts flagged the lack of information about projects, Chinese projects and projects provided with Eastern European support as one of the major obstacles in drafting 5-year plans for economic development. In one of the cases, Soviet specialists arrived in the country and they were shocked by significant discrepancies between the real state of the construction projects and their representations on the paper. To their dismay, local authorities presented them with unofficial lists of projects which had been completed in the country with support of the third countries, but not included in the general plan. And so such state of affairs made Soviet authorities conclude that 5-year plans never became obligatory in Mongolia. Another theme is infrastructure. So Mongolian officials, Mongolian officials preferred assistance from Poland and East Germany to Soviet aid. It had many advantages, and it allowed Mongolia to secure exclusive equipment and goods, sometimes access to foreign currency. So, for example, East Germany helped them equip the meat processing plant with machine worth more than $7,000 from the capitalist countries. It was an English king company. And to source Swiss dyeing pigments for carpet factory. And it was, of course, unthinkable with Soviet aid to receive these goods. However, Eastern European assistance also presented some clear drawbacks. So the Poles providing assistance, they agreed to provide technical documentation, supply machinery, specialists. However, they didn't mention any assistance in the provision of required infrastructure for the plant, nor the labor required to render it operational. Mongolians tended to request facilities with housing and supported infrastructure required for their effective operations. But in most cases, Eastern European countries were just unable to fulfill these requests. And hence, Mongolian actors had to contract local construction companies for these tasks. The major companies capable of delivering infrastructural projects were founded shortly after the Second World War, with Soviet and Chinese support. So this period of peaceful coexistence between Soviet Union and China introduced large-scale collaborative projects such as this Trans-Mongolian Railway, completed in 1940 and 1956. So this project involved an extraordinary challenge of flying almost 2,000 kilometers length of this railroad through Gobi Desert and Mongolian arid lands. Both Soviet and Chinese companies which were established in Mongolia constructed dams, bridges, power lines for this railway. And in the 50s, they switched the construction of housing in the capital, carrying out the full spectrum of work required to deliver these projects. In contrast, Eastern European countries never founded any such companies in Mongolia, and I will discuss the reasons for this a bit later. So the Polish factory was planned as part of large collaborative project in a town of Darkhan. It was a newly founded town in 1961, and it was chosen as a site for the major industrial hub in Mongolia. So Polish factory was one of the several other Eastern European facilities, also Czechoslovak cement plant, the GDR provided printing works, you can see several other facilities. And also China, at the early stage of the project, they participated in this joint project with the construction of metallurgical plant and glasswork. And it was probably the last major obligation of China before the split. Soviet Union also participated in this project, but their assistance was quite different. The main focus of Soviet assistance for the development of this industrial hub was the provision of all kinds of infrastructure, including water, heat supply, roads, railroad connections, fuel and energy facilities. Planning of all this infrastructure was a massive project which required an effort of 34 different Soviet organizations. During the development of master plan, a particular task was to take into the account facilities constructed with assistance of third countries. So this Chinese metallurgical plant, glass work. And the task was to resolve the issue of mutual coordination of these facilities. So all of these industrial facilities were powered by a thermal power station constructed by the Soviet Union. Also, Soviet construction companies took on obligations to build a high voltage line, a railroad connection, temporary working settlement, and later permanent residential districts. So the Polish factory was tied to this Soviet infrastructure, and its construction started only after the site was prepared for it. This provision of infrastructure highlighted major asymmetries between Soviet and Eastern European assistance. So taking obligation for the provision of infrastructure, Moscow became responsible for the costliest article of expenditures. Eastern European countries, in contrast, invested in highly profitable industries capable of producing export products, such as leather and meat processing plants. So in these exchanges with Eastern European countries, Mongolia soon ended up with 3 different meat processing plants, one Bulgarian, one German, and one Hungarian, although there was not enough supply for all the 3. Soviet officials complained that while Eastern European countries amounted for only 6% of total loans, and it's a figure given by Soviet experts, involvement, so their support amounted for only 6%, but production manufactured by Eastern European enterprises accounted for an ample share of 30 to 45% of total Mongolian export. Yeah, so this was a major, major asymmetry in its existence. So another theme is labor. And another challenge of making this Polish factory operational was to find labor for the construction site. And for their obligations in Darkhan, Mongolian officials had to provide 6,000 laborers. However, it soon became clear that they were able to find only a quarter of its number. The shortage of labor was one of the most urgent problems of Mongolians' construction sites because of the predominantly rural populations almost lacking an urban working class. So all these violent attempts to settle the nomads and employ them as urban workers often were unsuccessful. And so they were never able to cover the country's need in the workforce. And so Mongolian construction sites increasingly relied on migrant workers. Eastern European countries provided specialists to Mongolia. And in 1960, there were almost 2,000 foreign specialists from also Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. But the specialists were mostly skilled workforce, and their role was limited to supervision of construction, training of local cadres, and so they were unable to fulfill this demand. The country which provided most of migrant workers was China, especially in the 50s. And this provision of workers was a particularly important aspect of the Chinese assistance to Mongolia, which distinguished it from other donors. The major influx of Chinese workers started in 1956, and by the end of the decade, a total of 21,000 of these workers arrived in the country. They were employed in all essential sectors of the economy, and at construction sites as carpenters, bricklayers, painters, plumbers, to the extent that, I quote, literally any construction site in Mongolia relied on Chinese workers, and no construction project is possible without them. So Chinese workers were employed in on both Chinese, Mongolian, and Eastern European construction projects. For example, in the construction of Soviet house building factory, almost 600 workers worked, and similarly in Eastern European construction projects as well, there was a significant amount. So the reports on the construction projects also often discusses these obstacles of the division of labor between Soviet, Mongolian, and Chinese workers and specialists, and foregrounded the questions of coordinations of this international labor. This role of coordination was held by Mongolian-based construction companies. This served as mediator between these foreign and local experts, Mongolian, Chinese, and Soviet laborers. Even a special body in Mongolian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was established to coordinate this work of Chinese laborers. So given the importance of Chinese assistance, the Sino-Soviet split dealt a lot of damage to Mongolian economy. And after the split, many workers were sent back to China, leaving a huge labor shortage and many unfinished buildings. And both Soviet and Eastern European projects were highly affected by the shortage of labor. Also, it led to mutual hostility between Chinese and Mongolians, sometimes led to fight between this group of workers and to many protests. However, despite all of these difficulties, Chinese construction companies still remained in the country, and they remained until the mid-70s, carrying out construction obligations, although with less contact with local nationals. Another attempt to address the shortage of labor at Mongolian construction site was by involving soldiers in the construction. So in 1960s, Soviet Union increased its military presence in Mongolia, deploying military bases and stationing more than 120,000 soldiers in the country. They soon started participating in construction work. And in 1964, this military workforce made up more than half of all laborers in Darkhan. These military construction brigades were also capable of delivering projects full with communication, foundation, plumbing, finishing. And their labor was integral in the completion of silicate brick factory. So constructed with the labor of migrant workers and soldiers, the factory finally opened in 1965. The next stage of the assistance was the launching of the production, training of local cadres, and establishing a Mongolian directorate of the factory. Polish specialists were sent to Mongolia for a half-year trip to help solving these tasks. But in fact, they had to stay in the country much longer. Due to multiple problems, shortage of raw materials and labor, the factory was capable of operating only a quarter of its design capacity and was highly unprofitable. Only after a decade in 1975, the plant starting to reach its target. Mongolian press mainly referred to it as a Polish factory. However, its completion relied on this assistance from other countries as well. These Polish specialists, they held a very different position to Chinese and Soviet workers in the country. Their role was often limited to supervision and training of cadres, and employment of the specialists on low classified job was often disapproved by providing countries. So, for example, GDR embassy complained the unacceptable misuse of the specialists when the Mongolian director was not listening to their advice and recommendation, instead considering them merely as a workforce, which is a quote. This is a quote. The specialists were a very expensive also workforce. So they had strong financial motivations to go to Mongolia and were able to purchase cars and other expensive goods on their return home. These privileges afforded to these specialists were mostly visible in their salaries. Eastern European specialists earned 3,000 to 4,000 tugrik per month, which was 6 times more than an average salary of Chinese worker, and almost 20 times the salary of Mongolian farmer at a state farm. And so these encounters between the Pole, Mongols, and Chinese citizens soon revealed rising inequalities and promoted many misunderstandings of internationalism. They also shaped the space of Mongolian construction sites in quite a peculiar way. So the construction companies were often responsible for housing their workers and providing them with all of the essential services. And worker settlements, they mushroomed around Mongolian construction sites. So only Chinese worker settlements made up for more than 6,000 square meters. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. And although working at the same construction sites, Soviet, Chinese, and Mongolian workers actually rarely lived together. Mongolian sites were surrounded by separate settlements for Soviet, Mongolian, and Chinese workers. And all of these settlements had different types of services, since construction companies were in charge of housing and providing services exclusively for their own employees. So Chinese worker settlements was supplied with specialists, among them doctors, dentists, bakers, barbers, and political instructors. These workers received Chinese press, main Mongolian newspapers also were translated into Chinese. Just like the Chinese, the Soviets also had their own settlements, and a military settlement, Военный городок, was created in Darkhan for the soldiers stationed there. It was constantly expanding and became home to half of all laborers in Darkhan. It also had its own medical center, polyclinic, and hospital. There was a dedicated organization for supply of Soviet personnel with exclusive retail shops there. So it's unsurprisingly that workers soon started to make often unfavorable comparisons of their living conditions. So at one construction site, there was 17 residential buildings with a club and all essential facilities for Soviet workers, but Mongolians settled in these gers And at another construction site, the situation was similar, but here the Chinese constructed apartments and moved into them, while Mongolians again remained in garrison. Also, much concern was expressed by the Chinese cadres, and in 1960s they complained that Mongolian. At one of the construction sites, Mongolian had a canteen at their disposal, while Chinese workers were provided only with dry rations and had no hot water to prepare lunch. So these realities of internationalism at construction sites were quite different from this official vision. And Soviet and Mongolian press continued to praise this international collaboration in the name of socialist solidarity, but the details of its nationally segregated settlements were mostly absent, yes, in this account. Yet for specialists, urban Mongolia represents a very different picture with much better access to housing. Due to engagement in Comic-Con markets, Mongolia seemed to have a privileged access to the commodities. East Germany, for example, exported clothing, carpets, curtains, and specialists remember the apartments furnished with Romanian furniture, which was perceived as sometimes unobtainable luxury in Mongolia or other more central socialist cities, yes, but became more accessible in Mongolia. And these consumer goods were also distributed in highly unequal manner. So housing, for example, was a lot of housing constructed in Mongolia was reserved for the armies of foreign specialists arriving in the country. Because the lack of modern housing and services was seen as a major reason for unwillingness for specialists to go to Mongolia. This unequal distribution of housing caused disquiet and lots of critique from the Mongolian side, that the Soviet builders are moving into this housing as it is ready. Yeah. But this privilege extended beyond housing and also involved special facilities such as shops, schools, hospitals, and kindergartens. So Czechoslovakia and GDR had their own schools and clubs for the specialists, to the extent that Mongolian urban space was dotted with residential areas which were run independently from local administration. One of the Soviet specialists, Mark Goldman, remember that Mongolian citizens were prohibited to use these facilities. There were elite stores in Ulaanbaatar with extraterritorial rights that were off limit to locals and that sold excellent Soviet goods. Even Soviets had difficulty finding this product at home, but only Soviet citizens and their families were permitted in such establishments. In time, guards were posted on the entrance to prevent ordinary Mongolians to get in. So industrial facilities implemented with labor of foreign workers and represent quite a departure from his official vision of socialist internationalism. Because the efforts to sustain this army of migrant workers and specialists increasingly led to segregated experiences in Mongolia. And in late socialism, this major social stratification was evident in other parts of Second World, as shops which served particular high-up classes of consumers were present in most socialist countries. But the case of Mongolia stands out because hardly any other country had so many specialists in relation to local populations. But by some estimates, around 2 million foreign specialists and workers visited Mongolia in different times, which could be more than a whole population of the country. Yeah. So this involvement of different countries in Mongolia not only created these inequalities, but also many challenges at construction sites. So collaborative projects entailed a coordinated efforts of different specialists, technicians, and numerous countries of origins multiplied these challenges further. Among the most common problems were language barriers, lack of coordination between participating countries, and inadequate technical documentation. So a thermal power plant constructed with Chinese assistance was equipped ended up equipped with Romanian machines. And after the Sino-Soviet split, other Chinese plants ended up being equipped with machines from 8 different countries. Mongolian personnel was unable to handle these machines and understand documentation in foreign languages, rendering these plants non-operational. To make things work, the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries had their own peculiarity of construction industries, approaches to design and planning, didactic methodologies, and urban standards. One engineer worryingly reported that there were over 2,050 standards of prefabricated components used in Darkhan, 60 standard sizes of columns used there. And so there were many attempts to solve these problems and to facilitate this international collaborations, and some of the most noticeable efforts were taken by the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, which is a socialist international organization which Mongolia enjoyed in 1962. So Comecon proposed to make the planning process more international with the involvement of international brigades of specialists. And since the 60s, these international brigades became a promoted form of cooperation of Comecon organs, which represented these principles of socialist division of labor. For Mongolian, this international brigades was formed with participation of experts of Bulgaria, Hungary, GDR, and other countries. And together they had to come up with a vision of the development of planning and construction industries in a country, and promote a more equal division of the obligations between the countries. So they suggested that the GDR and Romania would plan construction materials industry, while Bulgaria and Poland would focus on design and planning work in Mongolia. They produced lots of the documentation and 200-page report and a plan for the development of the country over the next 10 years. The plan suggested quite radical reforms, which was the aim to facilitate this international collaboration. So it proposed to coordinate all of the developments in a country by a unified national master plan, and also suggested quite a massive institutional reform. And probably the most radical suggestion was about standardization, because it suggested implementing a unified modular system developed by Comecon institutions. So this establishment of universal standards and was seen as a key task of facilitating international collaboration. However, such plans of international collaboration soon faced problems in Mongolia realization and were soon withdrawn. There were many reasons for this. One is that reform was too monumental and required massive investments, but also because the role of Comecon was mostly advisory and the institution could not enforce its decisions. But also this attempt of multilateral planning revealed many disagreements of participated countries. And Eastern European countries soon started critiquing this Soviet vision of rapid industrialization of Mongolia. For example, Hungarian ambassador in Mongolia raised concern that this development of industrial plants had detrimental effect on Mongolian economy, and that this animal husbandry as business that Mongolia has been engaged for centuries is in decline because of its focus on industrialization. Moscow in these exchanges, in contrast, started increasingly seeing multilateralism now as a problem in planning, which results in a lack of coordination of the construction projects. And they wrote that the specialists coming from different countries and organizations to Mongolia caused certain damage for the formation of correct, realistic views of Mongolian economy, carrying ideas which sometimes are mutually exclusive, which causes vacillation in the minds of Mongolian scientists and practitioners. This is the quote. So eventually they suggested subordinating all of the foreign assistance to Mongolia to one central planning organ instead of trying to coordinate it on a multilateral basis. So I think this is it, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
This was great, Kolya, and incredibly rich. So questions. Please feel free to either use the reaction button and the raise hand sign, or otherwise, write to me or Hillary about if you want to speak. Well, in that case, as people come up with questions, and I'm sure there will be quite a few, let me ask a couple of questions myself. And one is about the role of the Mongolian side in that project planning, because you emphasized planning on part of the Soviet or sometimes East European side, but maybe you can speak about the hierarchies in those decision making. Were the Mongolian authorities or different, were they able to revise Soviet or East European plans, whether when it came to urban planning or industrial production, once these plans were proposed? And maybe secondly, I'm always interested in the lived experience of internationalism, and wonder, with all these and what you described was essentially an experience of segregation. Each East European country or Soviet or Chinese workers had a very strict division of labor on these projects, which made their practical interactions difficult. But I'm just wondering, was there, even on the official side, by Mongolian or Soviet or Chinese planners, any consideration put into how our workers interact, or do you have any idea of the lived experience of these workers from different countries, how much they sought contact with others, with people from other countries, and how much such contact was possible?
Thank you, Rosan, for this great questions. And yes, I focus mainly on this international assistance to Mongolia in my talk, but of course, during the socialist period, the Mongolian institutions were being developed, and apart from the Soviet and Chinese construction companies, there were also Mongolian companies which increasingly started participating in these projects on a level of construction and also planning. So Mongolian Design Institute also expanded dramatically in the 60s, hiring more and more employees and carrying out more and more ambitious projects. And already in the 60s, the Mongolian Design Institute was capable of providing their own assistance project, which was also an important part of this solidarity exchanges that we not only receive but also provide. So we're constructing facilities in Vietnam, also in some African countries, and many specialists, of course, even if it's such exchanges were politically motivated, many of these employees of these institutes clearly took advantage of it because they were able to open the world, yes, for them. And in general, the Soviet institutions, the Comecon and others, they represented quite the platforms which put the specialists in quite a privileged position, but it was not for everyone, of course, but also for quite privileged Mongolian specialists, because for most of the workers, it was quite inaccessible. Yeah. And to your question of internationalism, most of these construction projects and construction of Darkhan were articulated as in these terms of internationalism. So apart from these brigades of specialists who were coming there from the socialist countries, they had also international labor brigades with Mongolian specialists collaborating there. Yeah, and the involvement of local actors was seen as one of the priorities in these construction projects. Yeah.
Add another one of my own, which is about the adaptation of Soviet or East European construction to Mongolian conditions, and this is something that I was particularly struck in your previous work about Khrushchev's march through the different republics of the Soviet Union and abroad, how Khrushchev's design actually kept reflecting local conditions. And I'm just wondering to what extent the projects Soviet or East European companies brought to Mongolia were adapted, how the urban infrastructure projects, which I assume they took from the blueprints for their own cities, took into consideration Mongolian climate and the histories and preferences of the Mongolian population. So that's yes, my question, and then after that we'll have Olga ask hers.
Thank you also for this question. Yes, it's a big theme of the adaptation of this socialist vision of urbanism to Mongolia, with many technical questions. There were these climatic arguments, how to adapt to specific climate, to the peculiarities of the construction industry, and to the labor as well, because there was lots of unprofessional labor in Mongolia, which had to be taken into the consideration. So, for example, when the Soviet house building factory was constructed, Ulaanbaatar, it came out with these buildings unusable because they are not seismic. They don't offer enough seismic stability, and the factory was closed for almost 4 years to upgrade all of his equipment there. But another major question was how to adapt this vision of socialist urbanism to Mongolian population, which in the 60s mostly lived in yurts, in gers. Yeah, and this was a big theme of the discussion. So in the 60s, most of this housing constructed by the Soviet companies didn't differ that much from Soviet Khrushchevki as well, and all of this rhetoric was that this is a basic universal system which can be good both for Soviet regions and for Mongolia as well. But yurts with gers, movable dwellings, they never disappeared from Mongolia. They often, the planners often turned a blind eye to them, just keeping white space in planning reserved for individual construction, which actually meant all these big ger districts. And in the 70s and mid-70s, they already started discussing that these gers are not going anywhere. It's difficult to provide enough housing and maybe not necessary. So they also have to be taken into the account in the planning. And so the Soviet microregions were sometimes adapted to leave more space for these gers and also to provide supporting infrastructure for them. But in Mongolia, Mongolia is the only country where these movable dwellings are used not only for tourists, but a significant part of the population still live there. And this is an ongoing debate there, what to do with it, how to provide supporting infrastructure, and whether to support these practices or to rehouse them and in urban housing. And the last time I've been to Mongolia, they were relaunching the Soviet house building factory, which wasn't operating till the 90s, for the new big housing campaign, in which the gers with plots of lands would be exchanged for an apartment in a tower block. But in socialist time, lots of the critique of Soviet development was that it's a very foreign type of architecture which has little to do with Eastern European traditions of the country, with white prefabricated buildings which mushroomed in urban settlements. But with gers around, they actually gained this very Eastern European look very rapidly. Yeah.
Great. So first a question by Olga, and then 2 questions by Lila.
Hi. I thank you for your presentation. I actually have a lot of questions, but mostly I wanted to, you see, I know that it's also was like exchange in like science research. And I personally know a guy who was known biologist in the Soviet Union and was going to Mongolia for expeditions, research some kind of bugs in desert, and he was complaining there was it was very difficult for as he was saying, civilized person to exist there, because there was no public restrooms, and local people do everything on just outside. It's just nomads who traveling from place to place, and they resisted to be settled in some kind of absolutely unusual for them buildings. And I know from other countries, it also was like resistance from tribal population, like in Australia, for example, they also did not want to live in just general buildings. They have absolutely different style of life. And but my question mostly, is there was some kind of construction of educational buildings, and how education was what was in this area, how kids and how adults were educated, and also what happens with all these what's happening with all these infrastructures, all these factories and buildings right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. Of course, Soviet experts coming to Mongolia not always were happy with their conditions in the country, but the Mongolian actors also not always wanted this kind of visionaries who promoted these models of development. And there was also a resistance towards this Soviet efforts of industrialization and urbanization of the country, which resulted in a coup in mid-60s, where a group of party leaders were trying to resist the influence of Tsedan Bal, who was seen as very pro-Soviet leader of the country. So not necessarily they all shared this visions of socialist modernity and education. As you said, you know, someone who was going to Mongolia in socialist time, there was really a lot of researchers going there, and they made important works on the folklore of Mongolian folklore, of studying it and writing it down. Yes, and also the provision of the facilities. Yes, and of the education in the 60s. A number of schools were constructed in Ulaanbaatar, and in the rural areas, this kind of boarding schools, as the students can spend the whole semesters there. But also not always quite effective. Yeah.
Okay, so next we have a question by Darina, and then we'll go back to Lily's two questions.
Thank you very much. I also have a few comments, basically just to agree with what you were saying, because I'm nearly 50. I'm from Czechoslovakia originally, and we had some family members who worked in international assistance, not in Mongolia, but in places like Libya or Iraq. And I can confirm that, yes, the living conditions there were quite unusual for our people. And the system was trying to compensate for the difficult conditions, usually in terms of climate and work by some privileges, definitely. And also in order as expert, for example, my uncles were like construction engineers in Iraq. It was also not automatic that the person would be posted abroad. They had to apply, and sometimes they had to wait for maybe several years. So it was kind of a competitive, let's say, position. Not always, but even for nurses in Libya, it was not automatic that you would apply, at least in Czechoslovakia, and automatically be posted in a developing country. I'm speaking, of course, in terms of period, I am speaking of 80s, more 70s and 80s than 50s. My question, and I think that was the question by Olga as well, is what is actually left of these projects, and to what extent they are still functional or at least playing some role in the society, and especially how they are perceived by the population, or maybe different parts of the population, because I just assume, like in all East European countries, that the population is very split on evaluating such activities of the socialist era. So I would be very interested if you have any insights from the local people, whether they actually appreciate this effort, or whether it's been for them, it's let's say a deep past that is of no interest anymore. How do they evaluate? And also, what is, if you are aware, what is the development now, for example, in terms of construction and housing, whether it's similar to other parts of the world when we have these huge development projects of, you know, by investors and modern apartments that look the same around the world, basically. But first of all, whether anything of this is left, and how is it evaluated by Mongolians themselves? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these questions. Yes, as I mentioned, the house building factory, for example, which was stopped in the 1990s, and most of these construction obligations, so many of them stopped working with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all these efforts to transfer these facilities to the Mongolian side, they were often not 100% successful. So a Czechoslovak hospital, which was built in Ulaanbaatar until the end of the Soviet of the socialism, it was dependent on Czechoslovak equipment, and so each year they had to take obligations to provide funds just to make this facility functioning. So in the late socialist time, many countries were quite reticent to provide new construction obligations because it created this kind of long-term dependencies, and they became responsible for making these facilities operational. So many of them closed in the 1990s, and these dependencies also continued in the post-socialist time. I know the Soviet case a bit better, and Mongolian Ministry of Construction, they requested for the house building factory and for other enterprises, they requested assistance from the same institutes which designed them in the 60s. It was a huge institute for the development of prefabricated housing, but in post-socialist time it shrinked, but it still kept the leading role in this projects for the development of designs of housing and of housing designs, blocks and so on. So it created lots of these long-term dependencies. But of course, lots of socialist projects were abandoned. For example, this project of collectivization and construction of collective farms. Lots of them are now abandoned and just visited by the tourists in Mongolia. They become this kind of ghost towns, which are also sometimes used by the nomads in their nomadic circles. Then they use the housing and all the infrastructure for their own needs as storage and so on. But another thing which disappeared from Mongolia is this military presence, and the military bases became abandoned. So now the major share of export of Mongolia goes to China, and it's an important partner, but the Mongolians are quite often quite reluctant to make this collaborative projects with China. There is quite a strong xenophobia in the country, which also probably started to emerge after the Sino-Soviet split in socialist times. And they tend to hire construction companies from more neutral countries like Turkey, for example, for new construction obligations there. And the perception, the popular perception, it seems to be quite different. The older generation has all of these nostalgic memories about socialist time and how they were integrated into this international and multilateral system. But I think the focus of younger generation, perhaps it's a bit different, and they wouldn't learn this languages, but look at Europe rather. I don't know if it's also a result of this Soviet assistance, but in my experience, lots of the Mongolians with whom I talked, they emphasizing this European character of their vision and culture. Yeah, and yes, and there was one more question about the specialists who were going to these trips to Mongolia, and it was, again, I know the Soviet case better, and in the Soviet Union it was a kind of a privilege to go to the international trips, because the specialists could buy many things in Mongolia, which was quite inaccessible in the Soviet Union, and there are many memories of this big black market in Ulaanbaatar, where you can sell and buy different things and make some kind of profit there. So they were not getting their own benefits, yes, on this trips, but also for European people, it was seen as a kind of this kind of a extremal trips. Yeah, the problems, the the specialists that are often mentioned in the archival documents, but I didn't want to spend enough time in Mongolia, which results in them often dropping their projects and returning to their countries. So there was always this kind of circulation of the specialists coming and going, which sometimes affected the projects in a negative way.
Great. So, Lila, would you mind asking your questions? You put them in the chat, but if you can say them, then that would be even better.
Okay, no, my question was more about the interactions between the different workers from different countries, how they were considered. They were workers that were considered better, or their interactions were cordial, they have competition. I don't know about, they were from so many different countries that I would like to know more about their interactions.
Thank you. Yeah, due to this engagement of different countries in Mongolia, there were lots of the comparisons between the construction projects carried out by Soviet companies and by Chinese companies, and the Soviet experts were looking at Chinese projects very closely in the 50s and also after the Sino-Soviet split, and they often writing a very positive reports about these construction practices, that they are very disciplined and deliver all of the construction obligations in time, and that all of these enterprises look very modern. But also there were different construction companies, and they had different reputation. So these large companies which were taking these turnkey projects, which were delivering everything, they were especially favored by the Mongolian actors, and they wanted to contract them for the obligations because it was a preferred form of cooperation for them. The Soviets instead wanted to develop local construction companies, and a number of Mongolian construction companies were founded in the 60s, but there were problems with them, and they were not as effective in carrying out construction work there. But in general, there were lots of the comparisons, both in the reports of the Soviet embassy, of the specialists there, and in the memoirs of these specialists. So what about the Chinese? What about the Eastern Europeans there, and how all of this cooperation is going?
Another question by Nadezhda.
Hello, Nikolay. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, and it's quite a big scale of international development happening in Mongolia. Indeed, so interesting to learn about it. I have a question. If you indeed know about this part of the development, you mentioned that Mongolian government sort of benefited from having different options and choosing contractors who would develop certain sites. And I'm just curious in regarding to Darkhan, did they have any kind of master plan, any unified vision of how this city is going to be developed? If they had, so who provided it? Who developed the master plan for this?
The name, is it Comic-Con? Are you asking about Comic-Con?
No, I'm asking about Darkhan. Darkhan,
yeah.
Yes. The city which I understand you're presenting in this presentation originally, and also how the construction site was selected, because as we know from the Soviet socialist history, very often any kind of city would be developed very close to industrial sites or sort of extraction sites of the raw resources. And so it's Mongolia is sort of a very, we know that it's sort of wide and not very urbanized area regionally. So probably there were lots of choices where the city could be established. So it's just more a question about what was the theory behind of the city in terms of visionary, and also sort of pragmatic part of it, what driven the establishment of the city. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for this great question. So, Comic-Con was Darkhan was one of these Comic-Con's international project, multilateral projects which involved collaboration of different countries. They had several such infrastructural projects, namely this pipeline Druzhba, which also was constructed collaboratively, also the electric infrastructure, all Union electric power grid, which Comic-Con was constructed. And in the 50s, there were projects of expanding it in urban planning, as well from this kind of more technical projects, which actually never happened. So Comic-Con never developed this kind of organs for large-scale collaboration in urban planning. But there were many attempts, and Darkhan, I see it as one of these attempts to divide the urban planning between different countries. So as I mentioned, this attempt was taken by involving this Eastern European specialists in its design, but it soon was reversed, and actually everything is planned by Soviet organizations, which provided this form of assistance to Mongolia. It's Gipragor, a Moscow-based planning institute, which designed the master plan and then updated it there in Darkhan. But still, the very fact of that it was a site with many Eastern European facilities and facilities with different countries, it just posed these questions of the division of labor and coordination, development of these technical standards, and this collaboration wasn't easy at all, but it was necessary for the development of these new methods and ways of collaboration there. Its location was chosen because it was on a Trans-Mongolian railway, so it has good connection. It initially Darkhan was one of the settlements there at the one of the station and a settlement around it at this railroad, and then the Soviet model of development required this kind of a kit of different industries. So factories for production of panels, for example, prefabricated panels, and also all supporting plants, production of cement, concrete, the sand and other materials, and all of these raw materials were produced in Darkhan. There was a huge coal quarry there nearby the city, and it involved this kind of a comprehensive planning of multiple industries which were located there. But it is also located in the north of the country, which was developed in the 50s. The town of Subatar, also in the north, was developed mainly with Chinese assistance, and this town of Darkhan and Erdernet there in this region with Soviet assistance later. Erdernet is another mining town there for production of copper and molybdenum. So the minerals, and it's a project from the 70s also nearby.
Great, Kolya. So is there, I have one last question, but if anybody prefers, if anybody has a question of their own, I would rather hear you rather than my voice. So any last questions? Okay, just so in that case, very briefly, one last question for Kolya. So I remember a Bulgarian friend of mine telling me that this racist expression, to sit down like white people, which I've heard from different parts of Eastern Europe, came to her family via an aunt who had spent time in Libya as a nurse. And I'm just wondering, and so we can imagine the situation of Soviet bloc people going to a poor country and yes, and developing or rather playing on pre-existing racial prejudices they had, and I think this is what also Olga was referring to when she spoke of her acquaintance, this reference to a civilized person. So I'm just wondering, first, what is your observation? What are your observations on this count among Soviet or East European workers to Mongolia? Did they, what were the manifestations of their prejudice, if any, of course? And secondly, how did, say, the Soviet authorities in charge of those workers react or fail to react to racial prejudice on part of the workers they had brought to Mongolia?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question. There were this prejudices, of course, yes, and they are also, I think, clearly seen in urban space in socialist period, and these international experts, they developed a kind of alternative infrastructure. So we had their own facility, schools, shopping centers, and also even buses just for white people, as you said, in Mongolia. So it looked like this kind of some scholars now analyze it as institutions inherit to colonial system with this quite rigid segregation of space. But also lots of these developments are analyzed in post-colonial terms as well. Then, for example, the Mongolian actors had the last say in the use of many facilities constructed there. And one story, there was a question about schools. Yes, so Soviet Union constructed a number of schools in Ulaanbaatar, but when it came out to be that there are not enough spaces for Soviet children there, that most of the spaces are taken by the Mongolians, because there was this kind of demographic boom in the 60s and 70s with Mongolian families having many kids, and they just used all of this infrastructure for their benefit. So it was a bit of a discussion there of what to do with it. Any kind of open racial prejudices were officially forbidden. It was forbidden to critique with Mongolian workers there, and a lot of efforts were invested in the promotion of this international collaboration. So sometimes it was easier to hire locals to construct something, but they were made a point to develop some institutions there in the country. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kolya. This was really an education. And I hope the rest of you will join me in, clapping virtually or otherwise expressing our gratitude for this lecture. So thank you. And thank you to the whole audience for staying to the end.